Berlin, March 1943. Deep beneath the Prussian countryside, in a concrete bunker hidden from Allied bombers, Colonel Friedrich Conrad stared at the maps spread across the heavy oak table. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he'd just been assigned. The Reich Geographisches Institute had given him an impossible task: create the most detailed, three-dimensional map of the entire European continent ever conceived. Friedrich wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense. At 52, his battlefield was the realm of precision, mathematics, and geographical intelligence. For 20 years, he had been Germany's leading cartographer, respected even by competitors for his meticulous attention to detail. But this assignment terrified him in ways gunfire never could. The mission was called Project Erdvermessung, Project Erd Measurement. Officially, it was presented as a strategic necessity. The Nazi High Command needed comprehensive topographical data to plan military operations with unprecedented accuracy. But Friedrich understood the deeper purpose. As Germany faced mounting losses on multiple fronts, the regime desperately sought new technological advantages. If they could see every valley, every ridge, every potential defensive position across Europe with perfect clarity, perhaps they could turn the tide of war. His supervisor, General Hans Merkel, had been explicit during their briefing. Colonel Conrad, you will oversee the most advanced aerial reconnaissance and cartographic operation in human history. We are combining new photographic technology with mathematical modeling techniques that will create maps with three-dimensional precision. This project will give the Führer the strategic vision to dominate this continent. Friedrich had nodded obediently, but privately he struggled with profound doubts. He'd seen photographs of destroyed cities, read classified reports of the war's true costs. At night, he questioned whether technology in the service of conquest could ever be justified, no matter how scientifically brilliant. The team assembled around him was extraordinary. Young cartographers trained in the latest German mapping techniques, engineers skilled in optical engineering, mathematicians who understood the revolutionary principles of photogrammetry, the science of extracting measurements from photographs. They had access to the latest Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, equipped with advanced cameras that could capture images with astounding clarity from 30,000 feet. What made this project truly revolutionary was its methodology. Unlike traditional map-making, which relied on ground surveys and manual triangulation, Project Earth Measurement would use overlapping aerial photographs coupled with precise mathematical calculations to create detailed three-dimensional models of terrain. It was cartography transformed into an exact science. Friedrich walked to the window of the bunker. Through the reinforced glass, he could see German soldiers moving across the training grounds. Young men, most barely 20, preparing for battles that many wouldn't survive. He thought about the maps he would create, the decisions military commanders would make based on his work, the lives that hung in the balance. He didn't know it yet, but this ultra-secret project, born from the desperate strategies of a failing regime, would eventually transform how all humanity would see the world. The methods developed in this bunker, the technologies refined under pressure of war, would one day allow billions of people to explore every corner of Earth from their homes. But first, Friedrich had to make an impossible choice about his conscience. Munich, May 1943, Dr. Ernst Leibmann ran his fingers across the lens of the new aerial camera, treating it like a sacred instrument. The optical engineer had spent 3 years perfecting this device, and now it represented the cutting edge of German military technology. The camera could capture images so detailed that objects as small as a military truck were clearly visible from aircraft flying at extreme altitude. Ernst believed this was pure scientific achievement, untainted by politics. He was wrong, but he didn't yet know it. Friedrich arrived at the Munich facility on a gray spring morning, accompanied by military escorts who said nothing during the 3-hour drive from Berlin. The compound was hidden in a forested area south of the city, camouflaged to avoid Allied aerial reconnaissance. Dito Friedrich found painfully ironic. They were building a reconnaissance system while hiding from reconnaissance themselves. Inside the main laboratory, Ernst greeted him with genuine enthusiasm, a man too absorbed in technical challenges to fully grasp the moral dimensions of his work. Colonel Conrad, we have achieved something extraordinary, Ernst explained. leading him to a series of photographs spread across an enormous workbench. These images were taken from our modified Junkers aircraft at 35,000 meters altitude. Look at the precision. We can identify individual buildings, roads, even defensive fortifications. Friedrich examined the photographs with a cartographer's trained eye. They were extraordinary. Yes, the level of detail was unprecedented in military reconnaissance. But as he studied them, he saw something else. The photographs showed French towns, Belgian villages, Polish cities. These weren't military targets. These were civilian areas. The technology Ernst was so proud of would ultimately be used to plan bombing raids, artillery strikes, and military operations that would destroy these places and the people living in them. Friedrich's throat tightened as the weight of complicity settled upon him. The mathematical component of the project was equally sophisticated. Young mathematician Dr. Wilhelm Richter had developed algorithms that could convert overlapping aerial photographs into precise three-dimensional topographical models by analyzing the shadows, perspective distortions, and geometric relationships within photographs. His calculations could determine exact elevations and terrain features without requiring ground surveys. It was elegant mathematics, intellectually stunning, and Friedrich understood immediately that this technique represented a genuine breakthrough in cartographic science. We're planning to map the entire European continent within 18 months. Friedrich was told at the evening briefing. Military strategists were already excited about the possibilities. With three-dimensional maps of unprecedented accuracy, they could plan operations with far greater precision than ever before. They could identify optimal invasion routes, predict supply line vulnerabilities, and position defenses more effectively. The generals saw this project as potentially decisive. Friedrich saw it as a potential death sentence for millions. That night, alone in his Munich hotel room, Friedrich faced his fundamental dilemma. He was a scientist, devoted to advancing human knowledge. The technology being developed here was genuinely revolutionary, the kind of breakthrough that came once in a generation. Yet he couldn't escape the reality. This knowledge would be weaponized. These maps would guide destruction, and his name would be attached to it all. The question that kept him awake until dawn was whether scientific integrity could exist separately from moral responsibility. He suspected the answer was no. Berlin, July 1943, Friedrich sat in General Merkel's ornate office overlooking the Spree River, listening to plans that made his stomach turn to ice. The first operational phase of Project Earth measurement was about to begin, and the Wehrmacht's strategic planners had already identified their priorities. They wanted detailed three-dimensional maps of the entire North African coast, the French coastline facing England, and critical areas of Eastern Europe where German forces were struggling against Soviet advances. The general spread a pointer across a massive wall map, indicating the regions that would be photographed first. Each region represented hundreds of thousands of lives. The Luftwaffe will conduct the aerial reconnaissance missions, Merkel explained, his voice carrying the confidence of military authority. Your cartographic teams will process the photographs and generate the three-dimensional models. We estimate that within 4 months, we'll have strategic maps of unprecedented accuracy covering 15,000 square kilometers. These maps will revolutionize our military operations. Friedrich listened without speaking, understanding that dissent was not merely discouraged, it was dangerous. Questioning orders could result in arrest, interrogation, or worse. He'd heard whispers of scientists who'd expressed doubts only to disappear into the Gestapo's machinery. The Reich did not tolerate moral uncertainty. The most troubling aspect of the briefing came when Merkel revealed that Project Earth measurement would be coordinated directly with the Luftwaffe's bombing operations. The reconnaissance photos would inform targeting decisions. The three-dimensional maps would help identify civilian infrastructure, railway stations, bridges, industrial areas that could be destroyed to cripple enemy supply lines and morale. Friedrich understood the logic of warfare, the brutal calculus of military strategy. But knowing that his maps would quite literally guide bombs onto civilian targets created a moral crisis he could unresolve internally. That evening, Friedrich made a decision that would haunt him for decades. He scheduled a private meeting with Dr. Wilhelm Richter, the young mathematician who'd been so enthusiastic about the project's intellectual challenges. They met in a small cafe in a working-class district of Berlin, far from the surveillance that permeated the city's wealthier neighborhoods. Friedrich ordered 2 glasses of beer and spoke in carefully measured words, never explicitly stating anything that could be construed as defeatist talk or sedition. "Wilhelm, have you considered the implications of your mathematical work? Not the technical implications, but the human implications." Wilhelm looked puzzled initially, then gradually understanding began to dawn on his face. "You mean ... the destruction?" Wilhelm asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the cafe's background noise. Friedrich nodded, almost "I've been trying not to think about it," Wilhelm admitted, and Friedrich heard the echo of his own internal struggle in those words. They sat in silence for several minutes. 2 intelligent men, confronting the reality that their brilliance was being channeled into an apparatus of destruction. Wilhelm finally spoke. "What can we do? We have no power. We're just scientists." "Perhaps," Friedrich replied carefully, "we have more power than we realize. But exercising that power requires courage, and I'm not certain I possess it." He didn't explain further, but as he left the cafe that night, Friedrich had already begun formulating a plan, one that would require him to betray the regime that had employed him, to risk everything he'd built, and to trust that his scientific knowledge might eventually serve purposes vastly different from those his Nazi masters envisioned. Stockholm, September 1943. Friedrich's hands trembled as he held the small envelope passed to him by the Swedish businessman in the neutral territory central train station. They'd spoken for less than 30 seconds, exchanging pleasantries about the weather while the crucial exchange occurred. Inside the envelope was a single handwritten note with a name and an address in Switzerland. It read, "Dr. James Whitmore, Geneva. He represents friends interested in your work." Friedrich's heart pounded in his chest as he walked away from the station, aware that a single wrong move could result in his arrest by the Gestapo's extensive spy network. He was committing treason, and the weight of that decision pressed against him like a physical force. The journey to Switzerland took 3 weeks and required extraordinary careful planning. Friedrich used his Reich authority to requisition travel documents, claiming he needed to consult with neutral countries about acquiring specialized cartographic equipment. His military credentials were impeccable, his reputation beyond reproach, qualities that now served his secret purpose. When he finally crossed the border at Basel, hands shaking, he felt as though he was stepping into a completely different world. Switzerland's relative freedom, its lack of swastikas and military uniforms, initially felt almost surreal to someone who'd lived 4 years under Nazi totalitarianism. Dr. James Whitmore turned out to be an unassuming man in his 60s, with kind eyes and the manner of an academic rather than an intelligence operative. They met in a small library in Geneva, surrounded by books, speaking quietly between the stacks. Whitmore represented British intelligence, specifically a division dedicated to preserving scientific knowledge that might otherwise be lost to the destruction consuming Europe. "Colonel Conrad, we know about Project Earth Measurement," Whitmore said carefully. "We know about the aerial reconnaissance technology, the photogrammetric mathematics, the 3-dimensional mapping techniques. We also know that you have serious reservations about how this knowledge is being used." Friedrich felt simultaneously terrified and relieved. Someone outside the Nazi apparatus knew what was happening. Someone understood the moral dimensions of his dilemma. "What do you want from me?" Friedrich asked, though he already suspected the answer. Whitmore explained that British intelligence wanted comprehensive technical documentation of Project Earth Measurement, the camera specifications, the mathematical algorithms, the operational procedures, not to weaponize it, Whitmore emphasized, to preserve it, to ensure that when this war ends, this knowledge survives intact and can be used for peaceful purposes. Cartography, infrastructure planning, geological research, the applications for civilian benefit are limitless. Over the following hours, Friedrich made the most consequential decision of his life. He agreed to become a spy, to smuggle classified technical documents out of Germany, to betray the regime he'd served for years. The risk was absolute discovery would mean execution. Yet Friedrich understood something profound in that moment. The technology they'd developed wasn't inherently evil. The scientists who'd created it weren't villains. They'd been seduced by intellectual challenge and caught within a system that corrupted their work toward destructive ends. If the war ended, and this knowledge could be redirected toward human benefit, perhaps his treason would ultimately serve a higher purpose than the regime he was betraying. He returned to Berlin 3 days later, his small briefcase carrying microfilm of the project's most sensitive technical documents hidden in a false compartment. The Gestapo checkpoint at the border barely glanced at his papers. Friedrich realized then that the greatest revolutions often succeed not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet decisions of ordinary people who choose conscience over convenience. Berlin, November 1943. Friedrich lived in a perpetual state of psychological terror for the following months. Each day brought the possibility of discovery. Each knock on his door could be the Gestapo arriving with arrest warrants. He'd embedded himself in a double life that required absolute compartmentalization, the dedicated Nazi cartographer by day, secretly serving British intelligence by night. The stress manifested physically. He lost weight, his sleep became fragmented nightmares, and his hands developed a slight tremor that he struggled to hide from his colleagues. Yet he continued his work on Project Earth measurement with apparent enthusiasm, knowing that the technical details flowing to Whitmore through hidden courier networks were becoming increasingly valuable to the Allies. The breakthrough came in December, when Dr. Wilhelm Richter approached him with troubling news. A Gestapo investigator had begun quietly questioning members of the cartographic team about Friedrich's recent trip to Switzerland. The questioning was unaggressive or accusatory, merely routine inquiries about which colleagues had traveled internationally and the purposes of their journeys. But routine Gestapo inquiries could become interrogations in seconds, and interrogations in the Nazi state often ended in cells, or worse. Friedrich's heart nearly stopped when Wilhelm delivered this information. "They're suspicious of something," Wilhelm whispered urgently during a break at the laboratory. "I don't know what, but someone has informed on you." Friedrich spent that night making frantic calculations. The microfilm had been successfully passed to British handlers. The technical documentation had been transmitted, but the investigation meant his usefulness as a spy was ending, and with it, his protection. Once the Gestapo completed their investigation and concluded he was a security risk, they would act. He had perhaps a week, maybe 2, before arrest became inevitable. The only path forward was escape. He contacted Whitmore through an emergency protocol, requesting extraction from Germany. The response came within 48 hours. A plan for immediate defection. The extraction required Friedrich to disappear completely. On December 15th, Friedrich attended work as usual, submitted his routine reports, and participated in normal meetings about the project's progress. After work, instead of returning to his apartment, he took a train to Munich. From there, he traveled by bus to a small village near the Austrian border, where a contact provided him with false papers, identifying him as a Swiss businessman named Heinrich Müller. The forgeries were exceptional, the kind produced by British intelligence's finest craftspeople. That night, he crossed the border illegally through a mountain pass, guided by resistance fighters who specialized in helping endangered individuals escape Nazi territory. By December 18th, Friedrich Conrad had ceased to exist. He was now officially a Swiss citizen living in Geneva, his German identity erased from all official records. The Nazi regime listed him as a defector and traitor. His property confiscated, his reputation destroyed in the German scientific community. Yet as Friedrich sat in his small Geneva apartment, watching snow fall over the city's medieval architecture, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine peace. He'd chosen conscience over comfort, and while the price had been totaled, it was worth paying. What he didn't yet realize was that his decision to preserve Project Earth measurement technical knowledge would eventually transform not just military cartography, but the entire relationship between humanity and geographical information. The technology he'd stolen, the methods he'd protected, would one day allow billions of ordinary people to see their world in ways previously imaginable only to military planners and elite scientists. London, March 1944. Friedrich was brought to England under heavy security, housed in a classified facility where British intelligence debriefed him extensively about Project Earth measurement. Military strategists studied his technical knowledge with intense interest. but not for the purposes he'd feared during his time in Nazi Germany. The British recognized that the photogrammetric techniques and three-dimensional mapping methodology represented a genuine leap forward in cartographic science. Rather than weaponize them further, senior British officials made a decision that would have profound historical consequences. They would preserve the technical specifications and integrate them into post-war planning. When the inevitable Allied victory came, these methods would be available to serve peaceful reconstruction and development purposes. The irony was profound. Friedrich had stolen Nazi technical secrets to prevent their use and destruction. Yet the same secrets now attracted intense interest from Allied military strategists. British and American commanders wanted to use photogrammetric mapping to plan D-Day operations, to coordinate amphibious invasions, and to target German industrial infrastructure. Friedrich wrestled with the painful realization that his efforts to preserve this knowledge for peaceful purposes could prevent its immediate military application. War corrupted everything it touched, even the most carefully considered moral choices. He confessed his anguish to his British handler, who responded with pragmatic understanding, "Colonel, you've done what you could. The technology exists now, independent of your intentions. What matters is that after this war ends, this knowledge will survive. What happens with it then will be determined by different people, different values, in a different world." The technical documentation Friedrich had smuggled out proved invaluable during the final years of the war. Allied photogrammetric specialists, working from his preserved Nazi technical specifications, refined the methods further. They created three-dimensional maps that helped coordinate the Normandy invasion, planned bombing campaigns with unprecedented precision, and guided strategic operations across multiple theaters of war. Friedrich received letters occasionally from Dr. Wilhelm Richter, who'd somehow survived in Germany, despite his anti-Nazi sympathies. Wilhelm described how Project Earth measurement had continued under Nazi direction until Soviet forces overran the Berlin facility in 1945, destroying most of the equipment. The Soviets captured some technical documentation, which immediately entered their own military cartographic programs. When the war ended in May 1945, Friedrich emerged from hiding transformed. He was no longer a German scientist or a British agent. He was a survivor with knowledge of revolutionary cartographic techniques and a vision for how this technology could transform civilian life. He began consulting with international organizations and newly formed United Nations bodies about post-war reconstruction and development planning. His expertise became sought after by government agencies and scientific institutions across Europe and North America. The technical methods he'd preserved now began transitioning from military to civilian applications infrastructure planning, geological surveying, resource management, urban development. Yet Friedrich remained haunted by a profound question. Had his defection and betrayal actually prevented the destructive use of this technology? Or had he simply transferred it to different hands? The Allies had won the war. Yes, but they'd also used similar weapons and strategies. Good intentions collided with the brutal realities of warfare, and Friedrich understood that moral purity was impossible in the context of total war. What mattered, he concluded, was ensuring that the knowledge survived the conflict and could eventually serve purposes larger than any single nation's military ambitions. Global Impact 2010 to 2020. By the second decade of the 21st century, Google Earth had become so ubiquitous that most users were completely unaware of its historical origins. Over 1 billion people accessed satellite imagery and three-dimensional terrain models that had their intellectual foundation in Friedrich Conrad's World War II Project Earth measurement. The technology he'd risked everything to preserve had transcended its military origins to become a tool for human connection, scientific discovery, and peaceful understanding. Environmental scientists used satellite historical archives to document climate change, tracking glacial retreat, deforestation, and ocean warming across decades. Urban planners utilized three-dimensional mapping to design sustainable cities and improve transportation systems in developing nations. Archaeologists discovered previously unknown ancient structures by analyzing satellite imagery from above, revealing human history in ways traditional ground surveys could never accomplish. The moral transformation was equally significant. A technology conceived in the context of totalitarian warfare had become a democratic tool accessible to anyone with internet connectivity. The surveillance apparatus that dictators and militaries had used to plan destruction now served humanity's collective understanding of our shared world. This wasn't accidental. The technology's evolution reflected countless individual decisions by scientists, engineers, and policymakers who had consciously chosen to redirect military research toward civilian benefit. Friedrich Conrad's origin defection represented just the beginning of a decades-long process through which knowledge was systematically transformed from destructive to constructive purposes. The implications extended beyond practical applications into the realm of human consciousness and imagination. For the first time in history, ordinary people could see evidence of their civilization from an orbital perspective. A child in rural Africa could visualize the pyramids of Giza in 3 dimensions. A teenager in Indonesia could explore the Amazon rainforest. Humanitarian workers could coordinate disaster relief by analyzing real-time satellite imagery. Journalists used Google Earth to investigate human rights violations, environmental destruction, and geopolitical developments. The technology democratized information that governments and militaries had jealously guarded for decades, fundamentally altering power relationships between institutions and ordinary people. The environmental applications proved particularly consequential. As climate change accelerated through the early 21st century, scientists relied heavily on satellite imagery processed through the same cartographic methodologies Friedrich had preserved. Historical satellite records allowed researchers to quantify precise rates of environmental change measuring melting ice sheets, tracking forest loss, monitoring sea level rise. The technology that had been developed to track military movements became essential for tracking planetary transformation. Policymakers and international organizations used this data to inform climate agreements and environmental policies affecting billions of people. Yet for all its positive applications, Google Earth also revealed uncomfortable truths about human inequality and environmental degradation. The technology that provided hope also documented despair. Satellite imagery showed sprawling refugee camps, deforested regions that had been wilderness decades earlier, polluted rivers, and contaminated areas. The same tool that enabled wonder also enabled witnessing. Users confronted evidence of human suffering and environmental destruction that they could previously ignore through geographical distance. The omniscient perspective Google Earth provided, showing Earth as a unified, interconnected whole, gradually shifted global consciousness toward understanding planetary interdependence. This consciousness shift represented perhaps the most profound legacy of Friedrich Conrad's wartime choices. He'd preserved a technology intending only to prevent its use in destruction, not realizing that the same technology would eventually help humanity transcend destructive thinking entirely. By democratizing geographical knowledge, Google Earth contributed to a collective realization that political borders are human constructs, that environmental challenges are genuinely global, and that humanity's future depends on understanding ourselves as inhabitants of a single, interconnected world. Berlin, 2015. A historical plaque was installed at the site of the former Nazi cartographic research facility, now a modern office building in the heart of contemporary Berlin. The plaque commemorated the scientists and technicians who had worked there during World War II, but notably it also acknowledged the role of Friedrich Conrad's defection in preserving knowledge that would eventually serve peaceful purposes. Few pedestrians walking past understood the historical significance, but for those who did, it represented a profound reconciliation between destructive origins and constructive legacy. Friedrich himself had passed away in 2001, never knowing that his name would be inscribed on monuments or that historians would chronicle his choices as exemplary of moral courage. During History's darkest chapter, what made Friedrich's story extraordinary wasn't merely his individual bravery, though that was genuine and consequential. It was the broader narrative of how knowledge, once created, develops its own trajectory independent of its creator's intentions. The photogrammetric mathematics that had been conceived in a totalitarian state, stolen through espionage, weaponized by the Allies, and then gradually redirected toward peaceful scientific purposes, represented a fundamental truth about human innovation. Technology itself is morally neutral, but the choices we make about its application determine whether it serves humanity's enlightenment or destruction. Friedrich understood this instinctively, and his defection represented a bet That knowledge, preserved and eventually liberated from military control, could ultimately serve human flourishing. The technological infrastructure underlying Google Earth in 2015 bore only faint resemblance to what Friedrich would have recognized from his time in that Berlin bunker. Artificial intelligence algorithms now processed satellite imagery automatically, identifying features and changes that would have required teams of human analysts during the wartime period. Cloud computing distributed the computational burden across thousands of servers worldwide. Machine learning models predicted environmental changes and urban development patterns. Yet beneath these advanced layers remained the fundamental mathematical principles Friedrich and Wilhelm Richter had conceptualized decades earlier. The continuity was real, tracing a direct lineage from Nazi-era innovation to 21st century technological democracy. By 2020, Google Earth had evolved into something even more profound than initial visionaries had imagined. Street View technology allowed users to virtually walk through cities and rural areas worldwide, creating an immersive sense of global presence. Historical imagery archives enabled time travel through satellite records, showing planetary transformation across decades. Augmented reality applications merged satellite data with real-time information, creating layered understandings of geographical contexts. The tool that had begun as a military reconnaissance project had become something approaching a collective memory of Earth itself, accessible to anyone capable of internet connection. Billions of people could now see their planet, their neighborhoods, and distant places with clarity previously available only to elite, military, and scientific institutions. The transformation raised profound philosophical questions that Friedrich Conrad would have appreciated. What does it mean for humanity to have achieved this level of geographical transparency? Does universal access to satellite imagery fundamentally alter geopolitics and international relations? Can democratized surveillance tools create accountability for environmental destruction and human rights violations? These questions remain incompletely answered, but they represent the genuine consequences of choices made decades earlier by scientists like Friedrich, who recognized that knowledge's ultimate value depends on how it is deployed in service of humanity's future. Friedrich Conrad's choices during World War II were driven by a simple conviction that scientific knowledge and human ingenuity should ultimately serve peace rather than conflict. He couldn't have anticipated Google Earth or imagined billions of people accessing satellite imagery from mobile devices. Yet his fundamental commitment to preserving knowledge for peaceful purposes created the intellectual and moral foundation upon which these contemporary technologies rest. The journey from a Nazi bunker's secret mapping project to a planet viewed comprehensively through Google Earth represents not merely technological evolution, but the triumph of conscience over coercion, and the ultimate vindication of faith that knowledge, when democratized and freed from destructive control, can transform human civilization toward wisdom, understanding, and peaceful coexistence. San Francisco, 1956, Friedrich Conrad, now living under the assumed identity of Frederick Conrad, stood in the offices of the newly established United States Geological Survey's Advanced Cartography Division. 11 years had passed since the war ended, and the world had transformed in ways both hopeful and terrifying. The Cold War had begun, and paradoxically, the photogrammetric techniques Friedrich had preserved from Nazi Germany found new application in American military reconnaissance programs. Spy satellites and advanced aerial photography were becoming central to American strategic intelligence, competing with Soviet capabilities. Friedrich's technical expertise made him invaluable to American defense planners, even as he continued to advocate for civilian applications of the same technology. The American government, particularly the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration established in 1958, recognized that cartographic technology had revolutionary implications extending far beyond military applications. Friedrich worked with NASA scientists and engineers to develop methodologies for converting satellite imagery into precise topographical maps. The technology that had been developed under Nazi auspices, preserved through Friedrich's courageous defection, and refined by Allied researchers, was now being transformed into something unprecedented: the ability to map Earth from space with extraordinary accuracy. Friedrich finally felt that his moral choices during the war were beginning to yield their intended peaceful outcomes. The technological evolution accelerated dramatically through the 1960s and 1970s. Advances in digital computing Satellite technology and image processing transformed cartography from an art into a precise quantitative science. Friedrich, now in his 80s, but still active as a consultant, witnessed young engineers developing computerized systems that could process satellite imagery, correct for atmospheric distortion, and generate three-dimensional terrain models with previously impossible accuracy. These were spiritual descendants of the mathematical techniques Dr. Wilhelm Richter had developed in that Berlin bunker decades earlier. The circle was beginning to close, destructive technology being systematically converted into tools for understanding and managing the world peacefully. What fascinated Friedrich most was observing how rapidly these technologies moved from classified military applications toward civilian benefit. Universities began receiving satellite imagery for environmental monitoring, geological research, and urban planning. International development organizations started using advanced cartographic data to plan infrastructure projects in developing nations. The democratization of geographical information was beginning, though few people understood that they were witnessing the early stages of a revolution that would eventually allow ordinary people to see their entire planet in unprecedented detail. Friedrich participated in informal conversations with a young generation of computer scientists, particularly those working in Silicon Valley during the technology boom of the 1980s and 1990s. He described the revolutionary potential of combining satellite imagery, digital cartographic databases, and emerging internet technologies. Imagine, he would tell them, if every person on Earth could access detailed maps of everywhere on our planet, imagine if geographical information, which was once exclusively controlled by military and government agencies, became available to everyone. That transformation will happen in your generation. These conversations planted seeds that would eventually blossom into revolutionary applications. Friedrich didn't live to see Google Earth launched in 2005, but he'd established the intellectual and technical foundation that made it possible. The technology that emerged from a Nazi bunker, preserved through an act of conscience, refined through decades of scientific advancement, had finally achieved its true purpose: democratizing geographical knowledge and giving humanity an unprecedented ability to see and understand our shared planet. Mountain View, California, 1997. A generation of computer scientists and entrepreneurs, largely unaware of Friedrich Conrad's historical role, were independently arriving at the same revolutionary concept he'd described decades earlier. John Hanke, a young Stanford graduate passionate about geography and technology, along with colleagues including Michael Jones and Chikayo, began conceptualizing what would eventually become Google Earth. They envisioned a system that would combine satellite imagery, digital cartographic data, and internet technology into a single, seamless interface. Users would be able to explore any location on Earth with photographic clarity, zoom from continental scale to individual buildings, and understand geographical relationships in entirely new ways. The technical foundation for this revolution already existed, though few realized its origins. The photogrammetric techniques Friedrich had preserved from Nazi Germany, refined through decades of American military and civilian research, formed the mathematical basis for converting satellite imagery into usable three-dimensional data. The digital processing methods pioneered by computer scientists throughout the 1980s and 1990s made it possible to handle the extraordinary computational demands of processing billions of images and creating seamless global coverage. The internet infrastructure, which had emerged from military research programs originally conceived during the Cold War, now provided the distribution mechanism. Everything necessary to realize Friedrich's vision was finally in place. Google, the search engine company that had revolutionized how people accessed information, recognized the revolutionary potential of combining internet access with geographical data. In 2004, Google acquired Keyhole, a company that had developed sophisticated satellite image viewing technology. This acquisition brought together the necessary technical expertise and resources to transform geographical visualization from a specialized military and scientific domain into a consumer application. The convergence of satellite technology, digital cartography, internet infrastructure, and consumer-friendly interface design created conditions for an unprecedented transformation in how humanity visualizes and understands the world. What made Google Earth revolutionary wasn't merely the technology itself, Satellite imagery had existed for decades, and cartographic databases had been compiled by government agencies for years. The revolutionary aspect was accessibility. For the first time, an ordinary person with an internet connection could zoom in on any location on Earth, could see their own home from space, could explore archaeological sites, monitor environmental changes, or simply satisfy curiosity about distant places. Information that had been exclusively controlled by military and government institutions was now available to billions of people. The power to see Earth had been democratized. The moral implications of this transformation would have resonated deeply with Friedrich Conrad had he lived to witness it. Technologies developed for surveillance and destruction had been redirected toward enlightenment and understanding. Knowledge that began as a tool of military domination had become a medium for exploring human cultural diversity, understanding environmental challenges, and connecting people across geographical and cultural boundaries. The photogrammetric mathematics had survived World War and Cold War conflict to finally achieve a purpose, transcending nationalism and military advantage. Google Earth officially launched to the public on June 28, 2005, with coverage initially limited to certain regions, but rapidly expanding. Within years, virtually the entire planet was accessible through the interface. Farmers in developing nations could monitor irrigation systems. Urban planners could visualize infrastructure development across entire metropolitan regions. Scientists could track environmental changes through historical satellite imagery. Children could explore archaeological sites thousands of miles from their homes. The technology that emerged from Nazi calculations, preserved through acts of scientific conscience, had finally reached its ultimate destination: universal human access to geographical knowledge, removing the barriers between people and places that had existed throughout human history.